It says preparing live stream. Meeting is being live streamed. I'll just check on YouTube if we are live.
Okay.
It says prepare. Okay, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. My name is Ishan Sharma, and welcome back to Karwan. After a short break, we were away because two things, because I had my entrance exams, and also we were recording some great episodes of the Karwan Cinema Archives for you. So we interviewed Amol Gupte, Shama Zaidi. I'll be interviewing Muzaffar Ali, the maker of Umrao Jan, tomorrow morning. And there are many more things coming up on Karwan for you in the next 1 month. And then we will be traveling to different parts of the country to meet some of our friends, subscribers in Bombay, and hopefully in Bangalore, and then Madras for 1 day, Chennai for 1 day, we hope. But so much coming up for all of you. But today we are very excited to host Dr. Stephen M. Voss. So thank you so much, sir, for accepting the invitation. And he is just settling in Denver after his marriage and also his new professorship at University of Colorado, Denver. He is also he's currently visiting professor, assistant professor Bhagwan Suparsh Suparsh Vanatha. If I pronounced it right, I'm really sorry. Endowed professorship in Jain Studies at the University of Colorado, Denver. In 2020, he was awarded the Edward C. DeMock Jr. Book Prize in the Indian Humanities for his forthcoming book, which might come this year, Reimagining Jainism in Islamic India, Jain Intellectual Culture in the Delhi Sultanate. And today's session, in some senses, also relates to that. The title of today's lecture is From Court to Tīrth, Jain Reimaginings of Sacred Geographies in Sultanate-era India. So welcome to Karwan, Dr. Voss, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Now over to you, and we'll see each other after the lecture for a short discussion. Those who are watching us, feel free to send in questions, queries, comments in the comment section or the live chat. I'll be reading the live chat towards the end of the conversation. Over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you so much, Ishan. And I'm really delighted to be part of the Karwan lecture series. And yeah, I'll be sharing a little bit of my forthcoming book. Thank you for plugging that. It should be out in December or January. And we're talking about creating a paperback edition for Routledge, India. So hopefully there'll be a paperback out in the next, I don't know, 12 to 18 months after that. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started. So my book project really started out thinking about how Jain society has evolved over time. And I started out as an anthropologist in the early part of my career and was very interested in why it is that Jains are merchants. And the typical answer that you get for that is, well, you know, Jains had to choose nonviolent occupations, and so they chose sort of mercantile professions. And, you know, this is kind of highlighted in Alan Babb's book, Alchemies of Violence, in which many Jain communities from Rajasthan especially talk about their Rajput past and how they gave up the violence and militarism and chose more nonviolent professions. But one of the things that I've noticed actually is that the question is actually put a bit backwards. And it's not so much why are Jains merchants, because then you always get that same kind of potted answer about ahimsa, but rather why were merchants Jains? And when you start to think about the question that way, then you start really getting into the dynamics of Western Indian society and medieval India and into early modern and modern India. And when you start to dig into the history of this, of course, there's a great deal of evidence for Jains at the Mughal courts. And so this, of course, is a Vigyapti Patra that shows a Jain monk here beseeching Jahangir, and there's also a Jain layman here standing next to him. a merchant, who was asking for a firman to go on pilgrimage to Shatranjay. Now, if you want to go back to sort of the period prior to the Mughal era, the evidence starts to get quite a bit thinner. And so as you're looking into, well, how is it that, say, the Tapagach, one of the most powerful Shvetambara orders, came to power when it did in the 14th century? And how is it the most prominent of the Shvetambara monastic orders in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, especially during the High Mughal period? We actually have to go and dig into that history of how it is that Jain caste communities like Oswals, Shrimals, Agarwals came to form their identities. And that takes us further back into the Sultanate period. And I'm relying a bit here on the work of Samira Sheikh, whose book Forging a Region really makes a strong case for saying that what we have to do when we're looking at the history of Western India, especially, is look at how communities were settling down and starting to crystallize in this period, sort of in the late Chalukya period, in, say, the 11th to 13th centuries, and then into the Delhi Sultanate period. So just to give you a little bit of a timeline of what I'm working with here, and maybe what we'll do is look backwards on this. So going prior to the Mughal Empire, around 1297 to 1310, the Khaljis conquered Western India and most of what we would consider Gujarat today. And of course, in the around 1320, the Khalji dynasty falls apart and eventually gives way to the Tughlaqs. And the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, which lasted about 25, 26 years, really brought the Delhi Sultanate to its zenith, certainly in terms of its geographic coverage, as well as its kind of political influence. And it's in this context that I am looking at how Jain monks, and one in particular named Jina Prabhasuri, who was actually a Kartargach monk, came to be really thought of the Delhi Sultanate as, in this empire, as a new way of kind of conceiving of the sacred geography of India and really expanding the map of where Jains were going on pilgrimage, how they were thinking about different regions, how they were circulating around. And it is during this period that we get a whole new set of literary production in these texts called prabandhas, or narrative texts, that tell us a lot about what Jains were thinking and doing and writing about in this period. And so this period here, really from 1328 to 1333, is where my book is focused mostly, although it traces Jina Prabhasuri's career to help us make sense of how it was that he came to be the Acharya who was able to go to the court and to be so successful in securing firmans from the Tughlaqs. Of course, after the Tughlaqs in 1398, Timur invades and sacks Delhi, and that creates a new fragmentation in the political geography of India. And so we get the regional sultanates, especially the Gujarat Sultanate, starting in 1410-11. And eventually they get kind of brought into a new empire in the Mughals starting in the late 16th century. And so what my book is really thinking about is what were some of the ways that that writing that happened there in the 14th century really sets the tone and kind of the tropes, the metaphors, and the ideas that people in the 16th century, Jains in the 16th century, are using to sort of bring to that court in the new era. And so to think about how it is that the writing of the 14th century and the Delhi Sultanate period really helps us to understand like what kinds of metaphors and tropes were being used literarily to help Jains make sense of this new political reality. So let's look at the Tughlaq dynasty. Right, this is in the high period during Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign. This area in pink here covered a great deal of the territory that we now call India. In fact, it was actually the largest empire since Ashoka's territory-wise. And our story starts in a little town outside of Delhi called Asinagar in the text, which is probably modern-day Hansi. And the story really starts off with an image of Mahavira that was considered chamatkari, or miraculous, getting plundered from a temple in that small town and being brought to the treasury in Tughlaqabad. And the image, as Jinaprabha's story describes it, is it's made of moonstone and marble. And when it's struck with the fingernails, it resonates like a fine bell. And it has the ability to portend calamities. So it talks about an invasion of Rajputs that happened sometime prior to this, and that the image had sweated to sort of tell the community that a calamity was about to befall them. And it was also declared a favorite of alchemists for its ability to help transmute metals. So Jinaprabha talks about the importance of this image on many levels. This photograph here is not actually the Mahavir of Kanyanayana. It's actually now in a temple in Delhi, in Nogara Gully. You can go and see it. There's a little plaque there that talks about that image as the one that was sort of plundered from the temple and then eventually returned to the community. But this is just to give you an idea of what images in Jain temples tend to look like. So it's in about 1328 that Muhammad bin Tughlaq is holding court and asks his court who the most wise person they know is, and the court astrologer mentions Jinaprabha Suri's name. The court astrologer is not indicated distinctly as a Jain. This is all coming from Jinaprabha Suri's text. But the Sultan invites him to court, and Jinaprabha just happened to be in Delhi at the time. And they have a very interesting exchange that helps us think a little bit about what kinds of things were valued in the Tughlaq court. And that's up here in Delhi. And after Jinaprabha Suri is in the Tughlaq court, he is able to, of course, secure the image and have it returned to the community. He also gets a number of farmans or edicts that protect Jain pilgrimages and pilgrimage routes and allows Jain's safe passage throughout the empire. And in exchange, Jinaprabha agrees to go down to Daulatabad. And we all know that, of course, the failed attempt to create a kind of second administrative center was really one of the hallmarks or infamies of Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign. But Jinaprabha spends about 3 years down there until 1331. And here is the citadel at Daulatabad, or Devagiri. And of course, this place, everyone notes who writes about it, that the water there is very bad. In fact, Jinaprabha Suri also notes this in his text as well. Now, one of the things that's really interesting to me about this period of time is actually the way that modern historians write about this. And this quote really is indicative of what I'm calling a colonial and even post-colonial narrative of cultural genocide that really characterizes how Islam and Muslims are talked about in terms of Indian history. And of course, we all know the political effects that that is having in India right now. I picked this quote not because Saskia Kirsenboom is a historian of Islam. In fact, she isn't, and that's kind of why I chose it here. This comes from her first book, Nitya Sumangali, which is really about the Devadasi tradition in South India. But what it really shows is just how pervasive this narrative is. She absolutely did not need to write about this in any way to make the point that she wanted to make in her book. And so it really just goes to show just how much this narrative of cultural genocide is pervasive in Western scholarship. So the quote reads, in 1318 AD, the Muslim invader of Delhi captured the Hindu prince of Devagiri, flayed him alive, and set up his head on the gate of his own city. This event illustrates the cruelty and ruthlessness that accompanied the conquest of the Hindu South by Muslim forces from North India. With the ascension of Muhammad bin Tughlaq of Delhi in 1325 AD, the massacre of Hindus and the destruction of Hindu culture increased. The threat of extinction of Hindu culture, religion, and law, yada, 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 yada. She goes on. You get the idea. Now, I chuckled when I read this because I literally pulled this book off my partner's shelf and opened up to a random page and just happened to find this paragraph. But this came a few years after I'd finished my dissertation. And one of the contrasting opinions that we might set up against this one comes from Zia al-Din Barani, who wrote several works chronicling Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign, including the Tariq-i-Firuz Shahi, which is sort of the history of Muhammad's successor. And I get in at length in my book about what Badani's motivations might have been for characterizing Muhammad bin Tughlaq this way. But I find the contrast here kind of hilarious and interesting. And so Badani writes actually in the Fatawa-i Jahandari around 1350, rather disgruntledly, he says, the Hindus are held in the greatest respect and esteem and are honored highly. The Sultan confers on them responsible offices, including governorships of provinces. He allows them to be furnished with a complete paraphernalia of greatness. Thus, the Hindus enjoy all luxuries, employing Muslimans as their servants. They also carry on unrestrained and open propaganda of their books and disseminate their teachings, preferring Hindu philosophy to Islamic literature. And so the contrast here couldn't be greater in a way, right? Of course, Badani is part of an old family of Delhi that found themselves on the outs when the Tughlaqs came into power. And he had a few choice things to say about Muhammad bin Tughlaq. But of course, the idea of Hindus here isn't simply Hindus as we might think of them today, but it sort of means all Indians. And in fact, we even have reference in another Jain text called the Nabhinandana Jinodara Prabandha, which was written in 1336, of a Jain layman becoming the governor of Tilang or Telangana province. And this is also something that Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler who was in the court of Muhammad bin Tughlaq for a number of years, notes about him, including his own intimacy with what he calls jogis. And so Ibn Battuta talks about going into court and the Sultan sending for him. And this passage really shows just how familiar Muhammad bin Tughlaq was with Indian religious communities and religious leaders. He says, while I was still in the capital, the Sultan sent for me. I attended and found him in a private chamber, there being with him some of his favorites and two of the jogis. The Sultan ordered me to sit. He then said to the jogis, verily, this illustrious man has come from a distant country. Show him what he has not seen. They said, yes. One of them then squatted and lifted himself high in the air in such a way that he remained over us in a squatting posture. I was astonished at this and became frightened and fell on the ground. I recovered and sat up, but the jogi was still in the same squatting posture. The Sultan said, were I not afraid that you might lose your mental equilibrium, I would order them to show you much greater things than you have seen. So again, we really see just how much Muhammad bin Tughlaq knows and is familiar with sort of Indian religious practices. And whatever we make of the performance here that the jogis have put on, it's clear that Ibn Battuta is trying to tell us that Muhammad bin Tughlaq knows quite a bit about Indian religious traditions and religious figures. And so let's go back to Jinaprabha here. Who was he? So he was the acharya, or the abbot, or sort of head monk of a small branch called the Laghu Shaka of the Kartargach, a Shvetambara mendicant order. He was a very prolific author. He has over 100 hymns to his credit and about 30 other longer works, including commentaries and such. He was an expert in grammar and Sanskrit poetics, and he wrote a number of stotras that are sort of what he calls laghu kavyas, that they really demonstrate his mastery of the principles of kavya composition. He also wrote the first ritual manual in the Kartargach called the Vidyamarga Prapa, or the sort of the wellspring of the path of proper conduct. And he has a number of other works, including hymns to goddesses that are laced with mantras. And he wrote a number of kind of commentaries and explanations on what some of the most important Jain mantras, like the Suri mantra and the Hrimkara mantra, can do. But his most famous work, especially for historians today, is called the Vivida Tīrtha Kalpa, which might be translated as something like chapters on many pilgrimage places. And you'll see me note it throughout this talk as the VTK. And this is considered a Prabandha work, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And in that text, he tells us that he secured farmans for Jains for safe passage throughout the empire to protect a number of pilgrimage sites. And he recovered the image of Mahavira from Muhammad bin Tughlaq and had it returned to the community in Delhi. And what's really interesting about this is that in that first encounter there in Tughlaqabad, right, Jinnah Prabhasuri talks about his first interaction with the Sultan and giving him an ashirwad or benediction. And he does it in the form of a finely wrought poetic verse. And so the passage goes, at that moment, Jinnah Prabha delivered a benediction of finely wrought verses, along with an explanation of it so skilled and clever that the Sultan was exceedingly delighted and astonished. In fact, the term that's used there is also chamatkari. This is, of course, a Prakrit work. And it's this astonishment of the Sultan that leads the Sultan to, of course, quite like Jinnah Prabhasuri. He also wins in a debate with many other religious leaders, both Muslim and Hindu, and comes to be quite a trusted advisor, as Jinnah Prabhasuri portrays it in the text. And so I started looking into Jinnah Prabhasuri's works to try to figure out what of his works, what of his works might have produced such astonishment. And what's really interesting is Jinnah Prabhasuri composed at least 2 Chitrakavya hymns, as well as a manual about how to compose Chitrakavyas. And so he wrote one that's a Mahavira Stotra, sort of a hymn to the Jinnah Mahavira, in which he talks about it as able to produce astonishment, right? That is Chitrakrit. And so, right, his opening verse is, I will joyously praise the Jinnavira, whose deeds are astonishing, with extremely beautiful figures, beginning with against and with the grain, and also the sword and the like. And if you've never seen Chitrakavyas here, I'll give you just a couple of examples from this hymn. So he starts off with a series of what we might think of as palindromes. This one is meant to be read back and forth for each pada, right? So each of the quarters is a palindrome. Right? I praise the Lord whose self-control is great. Yahashemaya, Yamashaya, all right, who is an abode of self-restraint for achieving equanimity. Nayenagha Ganhayena, by that leader, egotism, thick with sin, apakrita mamata kripa, and without compassion is destroyed. All right, so you see that he's really playing with language. And I started to look into these Chitrakavyas, right? Of course, he has another one that's an ekakshara verse, right? Here he's using all just guz. I won't recite it, but it's a very nice image of peacocks, right? Making their peacock cry in the shade with other crows and herons who've come for water. All right, and this whole thing is a metaphor for the sort of the cooling nature of the Jinnah's teachings, right? That cools the passions, right? As if it were such a beautiful pond in the scorching hot desert, how is it that your teaching is so easily obtained, even for people bereft of good acts? So one of the interesting things, one of the interesting things about the Chitrakavyas is that this was really an oral and aural genre that was meant for performance. Figures like Abhinavagupta and Anandavardhana kind of disparaged Chitrakavya as not producing rasa and therefore as a lower, a third tier of poetry. But interestingly enough, both of them composed their own Chitrakavyas. And looking around, one of the things that a lot of Jain monks did in this period was produce at least 1 or 2 Chitrakavya hymns. Of course, Chitrakavyas often feature as one chapter in much longer sort of Mahakavya works. But these shorter works really show that there was a kind of a living practice of composing and reciting Chitrakavyas. And I think this was, really for the purpose of kind of courtly interaction. And that some of the references that we get in these and other hymns, especially one of Jinnah Prabhasuri's hymns to Saraswati, is to give him confidence when he enters the sabha, right? When he enters into the kind of the assembly of learned poets. And so one of the things that I think we're looking at here is a genre that was still meant for performance and was meant to produce astonishment, and that this very much was part of the contest of how one gained patronage through the performance of poetry. And so this is one of the ways that we see that Jinaprabha was actually trained throughout his career, through his mastery of grammar and poetics, to be able to be a person who could enter the court and sort of be successful in the things that mattered there in these kind of contestations. All right, let's move on. So more about this Prabandha genre, right? Back to the VTK here. So this is a genre that really emerges in the 13th century and comes into its own in the 14th. And these tend to be collections of narratives about kings, both historical and legendary, famous poets such as Sri Harsha, Jain monks, really from the period of Arya Rakshita onwards, so monks that are sort of more squarely kind of historical figures rather than legendary, and especially Jain laymen, especially ministers and even some generals. One of the things that we learn about them is that they are purposefully meant to be temporally closer to their authors in time and to their audiences. And most of them are in Sanskrit, although some are in Prakrit, including much of the Tīrth Kalpa. And these come in kind of varying levels of poetic skill. And interestingly enough, and this is one of the themes that we see in the Tīrth Kalpa as well, is that they often talk about their present in terms of the tropes of the Kali Yuga or the Dushma Kala, right? And sort of the period of suffering that in both the kind of general Indian conception of time and the more specific Jain conception of time, of kind of time's decay as a period of suffering. And so, right, this genre really comes into its own with the Prabandha Chintamani by Acharya Merutunga in 1305, and he discusses early on in the text why he wrote this collection of narratives. And he says, because they have been heard ad nauseum, old stories, namely charitras, do not please the minds of the wise so much. So I am composing the book, The Wishing Stone of Narratives, with accounts of the people who lived not far from my own time. So Merutunga really gives us a sense that he is talking about figures that we might call historical figures. But the didactic function of these prabandhas tends to be a little bit more practical in its aims rather than devotional in a way, because the figures that are talked about in the charitras tend to be the 63 Shalaka Purushas, right? The illustrious people, the Jinnas, right? Of course, the figures like the Vasudevas and Prativasudevas and Baladevas, as well as some of the other emperors and conquerors of the deep, deep past. These are more squarely historical figures that we know probably existed, that we have inscriptions to talk about their lives. In that sense, we can talk about them as historical figures. Let me give you just a little bit of a timeline here. There are actually two texts that are also kind of grouped into the Prabandha genre that come from the 13th century. The Prabandhavali, which is now lost, which was meant to be composed for the son of a famous Jain merchant and minister named Vastupala. And the Deeds of the Glorifiers of Prabhavaka Charitra, that was, as the text tells us, is still using the Charitra mode to talk about some of the great famous monks of the Jain past, figures like Adi Rakshita, Hemachandra, and others. Of course, with the Prabandha Chintamani, right, the genre kind of comes into its own as a sort of literature about recent past and kind of historical figures. And this is really where the Tīrth Kalpa fits in here, even though its topic tends to be more about places than it is about people. And in that sense, it's a bit unique. But we'll talk about some of the source material for the text and kind of where it goes from there, and how this really led to a major rethinking and reimagining of how Jains thought about pilgrimage sites as part of a much broader network. All right, so let's dig a little bit more into this Tīrth Kalpa. The text is edited in the Singhi Jaina series, so you should be able to get it on the Jain e-library. and it's also available in a number of libraries around India. It's about 63 chapters long, 63 kalpas, and it deals with about 48 different pilgrimage places and cities that have famous Jain temples in them. About 2/3 of it is in Prakrit and 1/3 in Sanskrit. And the chapters that we have dated are composed between 1308 and 1333. As we talked about, it's part of the Prabandha genre. And it tends to blend kind of eulogies of the sites, right? So it tends to be somewhat devotional. It includes a number of stotras and hymns in it, as well as kind of more descriptive events of the sites that are kind of temporally closer to us in time. And it mentions specific figures who, say, built temples, restored temples, things like that in the site. Right. And so it describes these sites in terms of the mountain itself, right? So it talks about the landscape, talks about the cities, it talks about the intervention of gods in restoring or protecting sites, so the Shasandevas. It also talks about the works of kings and monks to sort of protect or restore places. And it discusses laymen, especially, who are patrons of the sites. And there's a good discussion of alchemy for many of the sites, especially Shatrunjay and Girnar, which are the first two groups of chapters that are in this text. But Jinna Prabhasuri himself called the text the Kalpa Pradipa, or as I'm translating it, a light on the age, which is his original title for the text that appears at the very end. And I think this is important to keep in mind, that this text lived a long afterlife and eventually acquired this title of Vivida Tīrtha Kalpa as some sort of lonely guidebook planet to medieval Jain Tirthas. But for him, he's really thinking about how all of these places are transformed in this period, and that the calamities that they face, some political, some sort of through neglect, have all led to a restoration of the communities in the places where he's writing about. So if a temple is plundered, sometimes by Muslims, sometimes by Rajputs, sometimes by Kiratas, sort of forest hunters and other tribal groups. He also talks about much older conquests, such as the sack of Vallabhi in the 8th century. And so he's putting all of this into a discussion of the Kali Yuga and how the Kali Yuga, or the Dushamakala's deleterious effects, can be overcome through the efforts of various communities to come together and restore these, sometimes with divine help and sometimes simply just as a community. And it is in this text that he discusses, right, meeting the Sultan and acquiring these firmans. And it's in this context that his own interventions are placed in this broader discussion of how various Jain communities have come together to restore their temples and kind of reinvigorate the communities themselves. As I say, counteracting the Kali Yuga's effects is a key to reading and understanding this text, as I argue in the book. And one of the other things that it does is it really helps Jains to sort of create a much broader map of the sacred geography of India. So in the Prabandha Chintamani, that 1305 text that I just talked about, there's a long discussion of Vastupal and Tejpal's pilgrimage. Right, these were two famous Jain monks and ministers. Sorry, not monks. They were laymen and ministers to the Vaghela king. And they go on pilgrimage from Patan to Mount Abu, Shatrunjay and Girnar, and stops off at Shankeshwar, Parshvanath's temple there, and of course go through the major Jain community that's living in Stamba Tirtha, or Kembe. And so this is kind of the geography that the Prabandha Chintamani is interested in at this point in time. And this is how it's transformed in the Vivida Tīrtha Kalpa, right? Much broader, includes both the Western Indian and the Gangetic Plain sites, as well as a few sites in the Deccan here. So Pratisthana is very close to Devagiri. There's even these two other sites sort of more down into Karnataka, sort of southern Maharashtra. To really get a much wider ambit of pilgrimage sites here. And in fact, Jinna Prabhasuri himself spends 3 years in Ayodhya from 1306 to 1308, if I remember right. So he spends the Chaturmas, or the rainy season there, composing a number of commentaries still looking for more evidence for why he would have been in Ayodhya to do that. And so this really kind of corresponds with the growing empire here under the Tughlaqs, especially from the 1320s onward. And so I've been really interested in how the overlap of the political geography and the firmans to secure safe passage throughout the empire also helped to expand kind of the ambit of pilgrimage and kind of the ways that Jains had thought about a much wider geography of what's counted in there. Now, there's a few conspicuous absences if you look back here, right? One that we might expect to see, right, is Sultanate-era. Gets just a few offhand mentions in the text, and that's really not part of Jinaprabha's interest at all. And of course, he makes Shatrunjay here out on the Saurashtra Peninsula by far and away like the most important Tīrtha. And I think for most Jains today, they would consider Shatrunjay to be, at least for Shwetambar Jains, consider Shatrunjay to be probably the most important and famous pilgrimage site. And so this is the very first chapter of the Vividha Tīrtha Kalpa to Shatrunjay. It's a Sanskrit work in verse of about 160 odd verses. And this is really kind of establishing Shatrunjay as the foremost Tīrtha. If you've never been, highly encourage you to go. It's a lovely place. It's known as the Temple City. There's over 800 temples in 2 different tonks, or sort of enclosures, up on the hill. And the source material that probably provided a great deal of the content for this chapter, the biggest one is the Satunja Kapo by Dharmaghosha Suri, who was a 13th century monk. And he really bases his discussion of Shatrunjay in the kind of the 63 Shalaka Purusha Charitra lore. He doesn't mention some of the laymen like Javada, who were more recent restorers of the temples there and established some images there. But about, all of the 30 verses of the Satunja Kalpa get retranslated into Sanskrit and included in the Shatrunjay Kalpa there. And there are several other Tirthamala and Chaitya Paripati stotras that also seem to have been part of kind of the repertoire of source material for the Shatrunjay Kalpa. So prior to the Vividha Tīrtha Kalpa, we do have poetic works that sort of list off tirthas, like these Tirthamalas, and the Chaitya Paripatis, these texts that are about sort of they're part of the Chaitya Vandan portion of Jain worship, do list off various sites. And what's very interesting about these is that some of the earliest that we find, including like the 11th century Sakala Tirtha Stotra, or the hymn to all pilgrimage places, right? Shatrunjay is listed 3rd after Ashtapada and Sultanate-era in importance. And what I think we're seeing here, and John Court and Eva de Klerk have talked about this a little bit, we're really seeing kind of a revival of Shatrunjay, or kind of a new interest put into Shatrunjay as the foremost Tirtha, partly because of the Chalukya dynasty giving such prominent place to Jain merchants as ministers through the 11th to 13th century, and that the VTK is really kind of a capstone in a way of this kind of longer process of making Shatrunjay kind of the foremost Shvetambara Tirtha. Interestingly, he talks about how much merit is involved in building and restoring temples there. And he actually says there's endless merit in protecting or restoring a temple. And when I read this first to the Jain community in Miami, when I was at Florida International University, everyone cheered. And they had me send in this slide to them, and they put it up on their wall as a way to fundraise for people to contribute to the temple maintenance fund. Now, interestingly, this Kalpa also talks about some of the recent historical events that had befallen the site. So he mentions that in 1313, the image established by Javadi was broken by the Mlechas, and he ascribes this as due to the power of the Kali Yuga. And then he mentions in the next verse that in 1315, the blessed or Sri Samara Shah restored or Udharita, the main image. And if we look back to another text, this Nabhinandana Jinodhara Prabandha that was composed in 1336, the author there, Kakasuri, goes on at length about Samara Shah's working with the governor of Gujarat there at the time, Alp Khan, to restore the images there at Shatrunjay. Of course, Alp Khan was ousted just the next year in a long and sort of drawn out kind of bloody coup that sort of led to the downfall of the Khalji dynasty. Samara Shah is also the one who eventually gets the governorship in Telangana under the Tughlaqs. Right. And that's mentioned here. So what's interesting about this is what Jinaprabha Suri sets off is a series of texts that come after his that talk about Shatrunjay. And that, right, this Jinodhara Prabandha text, right, really gives us a detailed account of the historical events in 1313 and 1315. And then also talks about the relationship between Jinaprabha Suri and Muhammad bin Tughlaq as central to the restoration of the site and to kind of the prosperity of the Jain community in this new period. And that what we really see is a kind of a circulation of Jain laymen, especially from Delhi through Rajasthan and Gujarat and down into Daulatabad in that area. And that there's a kind of a crescent-shaped trade route that seems to be established in this period through pilgrimage and through kind of business trade. Following this text in the 15th or 16th century, there's the Shatrunjay Tīrthodhara Prabandha, or the narrative of the restoration of Shatrunjay. And this actually fixes the restorations into kind of 16 fated events. And what's interesting about this is from this period on, after 1530, there's no more restorations sort of added to the list, right? 16 kind of becomes fixed as a number. And when later texts talk about subsequent restorations, they cut out some of the other events so that the number always stays 16. So it kind of fixes the trope there. Of course, there's also the Shatrunjay Mahatmya that I've somehow managed to pass over right here that was probably composed in the 15th century. And that text sort of takes the shape of a kind of an extra canonical discourse by Mahavira, sort of the kind of text like a Tantra. And it claims to have been written in the 5th century, but M.A. Daki's work really shows that it probably was composed at least sometime after the Vivida Tirtha Kalpa and probably most likely in the 15th century. And that also establishes a much longer discussion of the history and shape of Shatrunjay itself and why it is sort of the Tirtha of Tirthas, Tirtha Raja. So back to Jinaprabha Suri. In 1331, we hear that Muhammad bin Tughlaq is really missing him and wishes to see him to settle a matter of religious debate. And he calls the monk back to Delhi, in which he undertakes a triumphal return. It takes him about several months, I think 3 or 4 months, as the text suggests, to return to Delhi. And in that period, has a number of utsavas or celebrations along the way. And he returns, and his story is actually told by a junior monk, but also included in the Vivida Tirtha Kalpa, that he retires to a life of teaching and consulting for the Sultan. And Muhammad bin Tughlaq even establishes a Jain quarter in Delhi, complete with Poshadshala and Upashray, as well as a new temple that he had newly constructed for that image of Mahavir that he had returned to the community a few years prior. And it's here that Vidyatilaka is really making the case that Jinaprabha Suri should be known as the Yuga Pradhana, or the leading monk of his age, which is a new trope that really comes up in this period in the Prabandhas about these Prabhavika monks, right? These glorifying monks. And that the glorifier of glorifiers for each generation is sort of known as the Yuga Pradhana. And in fact, he makes some really bold claims here in one sentence there. He calls the Sultan the Siri Sarvabhauma, or the Sri Sarvabhauma, right? The blessed Lord of the world. And he calls Jinaprabha Suri the Suri Sarvabhauma, or the Lord of all Suris, or Acharyas. So he's really making this kind of claim here that the Jinaprabha Suri is really on par with the Sultan himself, who is portrayed as a great benefactor to the Jains. Right? He discusses that one of the firmans that Muhammad bin Tughlaq gave to Jinaprabha Suri actually applies equally to Shvetambras and Digambaras, who have free reign throughout the empire. And this is what an imperial firman would look like. We don't have any left over from the Sultanate period, so this is a Mughal era firman, but this is a diploma that would have been recopied and passed around and would have had a seal impressed on it for its legitimacy. And so Jains were able to carry copies of this firman to sort of show that they were able to travel untaxed and unharmed throughout the empire. Right. And he describes, the creating this Abhinava Sarai, this new quarter, complete with beautiful buildings right next to the Sultan's palace. And he named it the Bhattaraka Sarai, right? Bhattaraka being an honorific name for Jain monks, especially. And he even says, and the Pacha caused a temple to be built for Mahavira in 1332. And what's really interesting here is both Jinaprabha Suri and Vidyatilaka talk about Muhammad bin Tughlaq as sort of one of the great kings of the Jain tradition, right? And so Jinaprabha Suri writes of him, having witnessed the elevation of the faith, all right, the Prabhavana, done by Sri Muhammad Sahi, even though it is the fifth age, the Dushamakala, people carry on as if it were the fourth age, the Dusama Susama. And this is the period in which the Jinnas lived, of course. And Vidyatilaka says, just as when the Hindus ruled as in the fourth age, so in the fifth age, during the rule of non-Aryans, right, Anajaraje, monks go about freely spreading the teachings of the Jinnas. And I'm really reminded here of Bhatani's complaint about how Hindus are allowed to just go and propagate their faith anywhere they go here. And so kind of get some corroborating evidence of Bhatani's own complaint about this. And of course, this leads in the 14th and 15th centuries to a couple of new genres, right? Of course, the Tirthamala precedes it, but often as we get Gujarati Tirthamalas, they all fix Shatrunjay as the foremost pilgrimage place. And we start to get the Raso genres, right, in Gujarati and Rajasthani, especially of our exemplary figures. But we also get some legendary figures, of course, Shripal being the most famous of these. And these all discuss the pilgrimage sites with their historical events. So we have figures like Samara Shah gets his own rasa, and other figures like Jagadu Shah. Of course, the Jagadu Charitra being a famous Sanskrit version of this. And of course, the Prabandha genre lives on into the 15th and 16th centuries to glorify famous laymen. And even in these 15th century Prabandhas, we get Tapagach retellings of Jinaprabha Suri's story, in which Jinaprabha Suri is both lauded for being a sort of a Prabhavaka of the tradition for his interventions with the Sultan, as well as sort of being a cautionary tale of a monk not being able to uphold his monastic vows properly because he is so involved in the life of the court and politics. And so this really does show how much Jinaprabha Suri's story carries on into other monastic orders and through the next 2.5 centuries after his death. And it's really only in the 16th century when a figure named Dharmasagara, who is a great polemicist of the Tapagach, wants to really glorify his own acharya, of course, the famous Hira Vijay Suri, and writes disparagingly about Jinaprabha Suri, saying that he was, a heretic. And of course, Dharmasagara was himself excoriated for writing that about Jinaprabha Suri, but by then the damage was done, in a sense, in that Hira Vijay Suri's new poem, right, the Hira Mahakavya, establishes a new set of tropes and themes, but that are very distinctly built on the kinds of things that Jinaprabha Suri writes about in his Vivida Tirthakalpa for how to interact with a Muslim king. Of course, he's interacting with Akbar himself. And Jains become sort of part of the interest of the Mughal courts. And so I'll pause here and thank you very much for your time. And here we are back in the court once again. having returned here to attain a new Farman for a new pilgrimage. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Voss, for that engaging lecture and for those beautiful slides, actually. Very well organized, and it's rare to see good slides, but thank you so much for that lecture. Uh, uh, if anybody has any question, they can send in, because I do not see any question right now. But as we always say, that if you have any question, because most of our audience watch these sessions later, so if you're watching it after the live, please email the questions at swas@sas.upenn.edu, or you can send it to carvanheritage@gmail.com, and we'll forward those emails to Dr. Voss, and he can get back to you through email. So do watch this lecture again, because I know it's difficult to frame questions once you are listening to it, and you get questions after thinking about what you heard. So feel free to send questions anytime. I'll just check again if we get any questions. Not yet, but thank you so much, Dr. Voss. Truly, it was an honor hosting you, and I hope that your book would come out very soon, and we'll get a copy from the publisher, so that we can host you again for another conversation on the book once it's out.
I look forward to it, and thank you so much. And yeah, I know I remember as a student always thinking of a really good question the next day. So yeah, when it occurs to you, please do it. Just feel free to email me. I hope that my UC Denver email address will be up and working soon, and you can Google me there. I'm sure there's lots of ways to get in touch with me. So look forward to your questions.
Post your email on the live chat also, so that people who wish to, copy that email address from the live chat can do that. And feel free to email us or Dr. Voss directly with your questions. And Dr. Voss, we look forward to hosting you again on Carvan and in India, hopefully soon, once you're here. Yeah. We look forward to meeting you.
It'd be my honor. Thank you so much. This was lovely.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you so much, everybody. We will be back with the next session. I think we are still yet to finalize the date, but I think it would be tomorrow. But we are not very sure, because we are still figuring out some things. But day after tomorrow, we have another session. Then we are releasing our first fourth cinema archives conversation with Shama Zaidi. So do listen to that. As I said, we are coming to your city in Bombay and Bangalore, and we are going to have heritage walks in Delhi, Bombay and Bangalore from 6th of August onwards. So if you are there in any of those cities, please write to us at carvanheritage@gmail.com, so that we can send you more details. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care. Have a great evening ahead, and have a great day ahead to you, Dr. Voss.